Here we go, guys. Chapter 30. I'm in my classroom. I was going to do this outside, but I'm starting to run out of time, and I figured, oh, maybe I could show you some pictures with the on the computer here as I give you this lecture. And here you can hit pause on that screen right there if you want. But guys, if you need to take notes or anything, you can hit pause. But chapter 30 here, 1960. This is the first presidential election ever to have a TV debate. And it becomes kind of a big deal. Nixon sweating, looks nervous. He doesn't put the camera makeup on. JFK puts the camera makeup on. JFK's relaxed. Nixon had spent actually some time in the hospital, and he made this pledge to visit every single state, and it was just kind of wearing on his health and everything. And Nixon does not do a good job on the debate. He looks, his eyes are darting around. It just makes him look dishonest and this and that. And what's interesting is a lot of people who listened to the debate on the radio thought that Nixon did fine. But the people who watched the debate on TV thought Nixon did horrible. But anyways, guys, some of the part of the 1960 presidential election, part of it is here is like Eisenhower's attempts to scale back military spending. That kind of becomes like a big part of the whole campaign here. And here's kind of an article here. And I had kind of talked about this before. Eisenhower had give some, analysis on military spending. I remember his Cross of Iron speech about how, look at all of the money kind of they spend on the military. Look at this. Eisenhower said, every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies in the final sense a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. The cost of one modern heavy bomber is this, a modern brick school in more than 30 cities. And it kind of goes on talking about like how much money they could have been spending on other things if they weren't building some of these things. But look at this. This is not a way of life at all in any true sense. Under the cloud of threatening war, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron. Is there no other way the world may live? And the honest truth is, a lot of people kind of felt like Eisenhower had let down the country, that Eisenhower had, that he had suppressed military spending, and we're in the height of this Cold War and Cold War tensions. And JFK is pledging to increase military spending. And in the campaign, JFK keeps talking about the missile gap. The Soviets have more missiles. We need to spend more in the military because the Soviets have more missiles. There's a missile gap. The Soviets have this much missiles. We only have that much. There's a gap between the two. We need more missiles. We need to catch up and have more missiles. But it actually wasn't real. In fact, the CIA actually talked to JFK and said, like, all of our information says there is no missile gap. You're a U.S. Senator. You should know. But he kind of kept repeating it anyways. And here's kind of an interesting New York Times article kind of on this about how there wasn't a missile gap. But, Cold War, the idea that we're behind, the internet's going slow, but this idea that we're behind and we're losing it played well. And you could visit this link too if you wanted to read this article or the other article by going to my notes and so forth and just kind of like seeing it. Oh, we got an advertisement here. But what's kind of interesting here is JFK's Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, actually shortly after JFK was elected and sworn in, McNamara accidentally said, "Oh, there is no missile gap." And JFK was actually kind of livid because that was one of his key campaigns, as there is a missile gap, I'm going to fix it. And then, within the first month of his presidency, his Secretary of Defense says, well, there actually isn't a missile gap. We're doing fine. But it kind of helped, add to the Cold War tensions of the time period. We have this first televised TV debate. JFK looks good on the camera, Nixon not so much. One big thing that helped JFK, and this was a close election. People forget, this was a very close election. Illinois and Texas, JFK won by small amounts. And if Nixon could have flipped them both, it it would have went the other way. The overall popular vote was 100,000, which might not sound like a small popular vote win for JFK, but when you're talking about a nation of, you know, I don't know what the exact population of the country at that time was, probably about 160 million, probably in 1960. You know, 100,000 popular vote. I mean, that's a close popular vote. And as I said, the Electoral College was fairly close because Texas and Illinois were both narrow margins in those states. And had they gone to Nixon, he could have won. So JFK kind of squeaks in. And another thing, well, let me kind of go more on MLK. But MLK had been arrested for peacefully protesting. He really wasn't doing anything wrong. He was, you know. He does things where he like marches down the streets peacefully, non-violently, and then he'll get like attacked and arrested for, you know, not having a parade permit or whatever. But he really wasn't doing anything wrong when he gets arrested. Like, he wasn't actually harming anyone, but and he wasn't harming anyone's property or anything like that. But MLK is going to get transferred into the Georgia State Penitentiary. And MLK's family and friends are very, very worried that in the MLK Penitentiary, something horrible could happen to him. He could get killed or beat up or, you know, whatever. And so JFK's brother-in-law, Sergeant Shriver, had made some phone calls and worked hard and was able to help secure the release of MLK from prison. And MLK actually thanked publicly JFK for his campaign for helping do that. And that helped JFK immensely with the African-American vote, which often FDR started to change it. But before FDR, the African-American vote was heavily Republican. And you might be thinking, well, Mr. Morse, once Reconstruction ends in 1877, African-Americans can't vote. But that's in the South. There are still African-Americans in the North. A lot of these northern states are close. And so the African-Americans in the North, they had been reliable Republican voters. FDR starts to change that because they like a lot of his New Deal programs. And then MLK swings a lot of African-American voters. What's also kind of interesting, too, here is JFK is the first and still to this day only Catholic president we've ever had. In fact, Joseph Biden, I believe, is the only vice president that's a Catholic. Oh, I guess, I'm sorry. I forgot about Biden. I'm getting old as a teacher. I used to say he was the only Catholic president. Biden's Catholic. And Biden was the only vice president Catholic that we've had. And now he's the second Catholic president that we've had. I'm getting old. Things I used to say were true, but now they've changed. Oh, it's one of those years. I'll actually play a part of this video on the optional Thursday remote learning optional on Thursday. But if you can attend. If you can't, don't worry about it. I will record it if you are interested but can't attend your class you're supposed to. But JFK talks about this new frontier, that we're going to lead to victory in the Cold War, that with this new frontier policy. And we're going to do long overdue reforms. He talks about like there's this new age, this young generation of Americans who are going to kind of fix some of the problems that some of the older people, you know, maybe kind of put off or whatever. But he says we're going to do long-needed educational reforms. We're going to advance civil rights. The Civil Rights Act of 1957 was supposed to be a voting rights act. The fact of the matter is white Southerners took the teeth out of that bill. Although it passed, unfortunately, the teeth were taken out. So that's why you're going to wind up needing that 1965 Voting Rights Act that has to come under LBJ, in part because JFK is assassinated. He talks about getting health care reform. You're also going to see LBJ do some of this with Medicare and Medicaid to kind of help the elderly with medical bills, and Medicaid to help poor people with some of their medical bills. And then updating manufacturing, which a lot of American industry hadn't been updated in a long time. And Europe has a lot of newer factories, at least in Western Europe, in part because of our Marshall Plan, which is great that we're helping out Europe after World War II, after it was so heavily devastated by the war. But on the flip side to that, it also means we have to spend some money on our own factories because our factories aren't as efficient now compared to our European friends across the ocean there, and so forth. But flexible response is this policy kind of comes up with. Now, this is in stark contrast to Eisenhower. Now, Eisenhower talks about things like mutually assured destruction. Like, if the Soviets do this, we're going to massively retaliate, and you know, we're going to just, you know, if you take over Iceland, we'll bomb the crap out of you to the Stone Ages, so you don't want to take over Iceland. And JFK says, no, we need to be a little bit more nuanced. We need to be a little bit more intelligent. He's like, I understand what we're trying to do here with massive retaliation, but you could easily get a massive war, a war that's nuclear war, that leads to a nuclear holocaust, a nuclear winter. And by simple miscalculations, you could have a small little misstep by the Soviets that we maybe misinterpret, and then bam, massive retaliate. He's like, no, let's just ease back. We're going to have flexible response. We'll give ourselves more options. We'll publicly say, look, we have flexible response. We're not saying if the Soviets do any of these things, we're going to massively retaliate. We'll be, hey, we have to play it case by case, play it out as it comes and goes. And part of this flexible response, though, and you might say, oh, this is like less military. Maybe less military in some forms of responses. But JFK literally says, hey, we need more nuclear warheads. He wanted 5 times as many nukes as Ike thought was necessary. Eisenhower's nickname. So he says Eisenhower should have had more in our atomic arsenal, and we need to get more nukes. You know, and that's debatable, but he's like, we need to increase our nukes. Eisenhower tried to suppress the conventional army. By conventional, I mean things that are like, you know, like more standard, not the nuclear arsenal that we have. Conventional army, like our tanks and our fighter planes and our boats and things like that. Eisenhower thought, look, if we have the best radar, we have the best missiles, we have nukes, nobody's going to invade us, so we're relatively safe. We don't need tons of army tanks. They're expensive, and the more tanks you have, the more likely you are to want to use them. So we can scale back on the conventional. JFK had argued that left America vulnerable. The Soviet Union has lots of tanks. We need lots of tanks, especially when you have things like Berlin, which we're going to talk about in a second here. But he talked about creating Green Berets where they could do special missions. The Green Berets could, you know, sneak in behind enemy lines and maybe do a small little mission where like a pinprick as opposed to, you know, sending a bunch of missiles or something, bombers or, you know. So the Green Berets are created by JFK here. And a lot of this flexible response policies are managed in part by Secretary of State of Dean Rusk. Notice how like the Green Berets are like a special little tool that could be used by the U.S. instead of kind of going into up the scale for bigger things. But the Berlin Wall here, this is going to be put in place. You see JFK's first year of his presidency, and it's going to last all the way until Bush Sr. is president here. And remember how we had talked about how West Berlin, which is the British, French, American part of Berlin, is completely in East Germany. And how that had caused problems with like the Berlin airlift under Truman. It's causing problems here again under JFK. And this is going to be like Berlin's a huge point of contention in this Cold War between the U.S. and Soviets for many, many years. Khrushchev, he thought, you know, JFK's so young. He's still the youngest person ever elected president. Now, Teddy's younger, but he wasn't elected president the first time because William McKinley got assassinated. That's what made JFK kind of, excuse me, that's what made Teddy become president. But JFK is the youngest person to ever be elected president and second youngest ever to be president. And Khrushchev rolls this out unannounced. And he's doing this in part to test JFK, but also in part because there's almost like a brain drain. A lot of the best wanted to live in West Berlin. It was more prosperous. Remember, America's rebuilding its zone of Germany, West Germany. We're helping West Germany. We're giving them Marshall Plan money. We're sending machinery over. And West Berlin and West Germany turn it around quick, and they have this economic miracle people talk about, and this and that. Whereas the Soviets, on top of having communism, they're having reparations. They're punishing East Germany and East Berlin. And so the best people in terms of brain power and wealth, they all want to live in West Berlin, and they're moving there. And a lot of the, you know, the professionals, your doctors and engineers are moving to West Berlin, leaving East Berlin. And so this Berlin Wall is also going to essentially, you might say, kind of stop that brain drain. But it's unannounced, and it actually caught a lot of families off guard. And you can see, like here, this little boy gets separated from his family. They roll out the barbed wire here, basically instantaneously, all at once. And a lot of people got separated from family, or maybe you worked on one side but lived on the other side. And this is a East German soldier, kind of forced by the Soviets to do their bidding, and he defects, and he just looks around. He's the only guard there, and he just jumps across and defects to the West Berlin side. But to basically make a long story short, they roll out the barbed wire, then later put up the more famous that you might know. You might have seen a part of the Berlin Wall at the Gerald R. Ford Museum in downtown Grand Rapids area. But then they build the actual, like, more permanent wall that lasts from 61 to 1989, that concrete wall that you're probably more familiar with the guard towers and stuff like that. But they kind of roll out the barbed wire there at first, and so that's kind of what's going on here with this. And I had mentioned that the skilled workers, that brain drain, people leaving East Berlin, the Soviet East German side, to West Berlin, the pro-American, pro-democracy. You don't really get to vote here. I mean, you got democracy, you got free economics, you can start your own business and stuff like that. And another big point of contention besides Berlin is Cuba. Basically, in the late 50s, I think it was 57, Cuba has a communist revolution. And America had been kind of supporting Batista there, but the fact of the matter is he wasn't the nicest of guys either. But the Cuban Revolution kind of happens. The Soviets kind of, excuse me, the communists kind of take over. And we're instantly worried because, I mean, you know, Cuba's only about 90 miles from the coast of Florida. That's a pretty short distance. And having a communist country that close, and the Soviets start having some influence in Cuba, we just don't like it. In fact, now this Bay of Pigs, it gets started, CIA starts working on it when Eisenhower's president in the late 50s. And there's all these Cuban exiles, or people who fled Cuba, and they're trained, some of them are trained by the CIA to kind of go back and invade Cuba with American weapons and American radios and American equipment. And then they're going to start like a counter-revolution and throw down the communists and throw out Castro and all of that. And then it actually happens under JFK, and it backfires, and just horrifically. It's called the Bay of Pigs because that's the name of the water, the bay, the water bay. There is called the Bay of Pigs, where the invasion landing happens. But to make a long story short, this horribly fails. The people are basically killed and captured. The poor exiles that we had trained are killed and captured. And notice, I mean, JFK became president January 20. This is technically not even a full 3 months into his White House. So what a horrible kind of a nightmare to happen so early, because it's just a disaster in the international relations. It's a disaster, you know, kind of politically, and it's embarrassing. And he meets with Eisenhower to kind of talk about it, and Eisenhower said, well, why did you were supposed to give them naval and air support. Why did you cut out the naval and air support? And JFK says, well, I didn't want the world to know that we had sent them. And Eisenhower's like, well, They're all arriving on American-made boats with American-made guns and American-made radios, American-made helmets. Where do you think the world's gonna think they came from? The whole world's gonna find out anyways. If you should either not send them in or send them in with everything we got. You don't do a middle ground. You either go full bore or don't go at all. And so JFK kind of learns a lesson here. And then look, just a year and a half later, the Cuban Missile Crisis, a year and a half later from the Bad Pigs. Now, Cuba already has reasons not to like us because of the Bad Pigs. Now, to make a long story short, the Soviet Union put nuclear missiles in Cuba. They weren't supposed to. They, in fact, promised not to. But we forget this. Americans always ignore this point. We had put nuclear missiles in Italy, but especially Turkey. Back then, Turkey had a land border with the Soviet Union. Today, Turkey and Russia don't have a land border. Back then, Turkey and the Soviet Union had a land border. So we are literally putting nuclear missiles in a country aimed at the Soviets that borders their land. Maybe they shouldn't have said they wouldn't do it and then did it, but I can understand why the Soviets want to put missiles in Cuba if we're putting them in Turkey. But anyways, that's neither here nor there. The fact of the matter is, we come this close to nuclear war. I don't know if I'll get to show it to you, but I'd always show you guys maybe like a 15-minute segment in class of this great documentary. You ever want to watch a documentary? There's this guy named Earl Morris, not Morse like me, but Morris, and he has this documentary where he interviews Robert S. McNamara, the Secretary of Defense under JFK and most of LBJ's presidency. And it goes through his whole life story, and they spend I don't know, I'm just guessing, 15 minutes on the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it's just fascinating. We become this close to nuclear war. Thankfully, cooler heads prevail, and JFK is able to help navigate and calm down this Cuban Missile Crisis between the Soviet Union and U.S. over missiles in Cuba. And the Soviets agree to remove nuclear missiles out of Cuba. The U.S. agrees to remove quietly at a later date, so it doesn't look like it's a quid pro quo. The U.S. is going to remove nuclear missiles out of Italy and Turkey that had just been put there recently, just a half year prior to this whole blow-up. And the U.S. promises the Soviet Union, we're not going to invade Cuba unless Cuba provokes us by attacking us first. So we're not going to just send the military in and take over Cuba. And they also connect a nuclear hotline between the White House and Kremlin. There have been times where this nuclear hotline has been disconnected because tensions between the two, but this is considered usually smart because if tensions get so high, we can instantly pick up the phone, and bigwigs in our country can talk to bigwigs in their country and discuss kind of what's going on and calm situations down. But all right, so here we go. Now, guys, Vietnam, and we're increasing our presence in Vietnam. Harry S. Truman had kind of helped France with their funding and trying to recolonize Vietnam, unfortunately, after World War II. Then Eisenhower started funding the South Vietnamese, who wanted to not be taken over by the North Vietnamese. The South, it sounds just like the Korean War in a lot of ways, in the sense that the South Vietnamese were capitalists. They kind of wanted to be a little bit more like America, just like the South Koreans in that Korean War that happened under Truman. But Eisenhower had started helping fund the South Vietnamese so they could fight for their independence against the North Vietnamese. And to make a long story short, JFK increases this. I might be getting my numbers wrong because I'm kind of old, but I believe on Eisenhower's last day in office, we had about 1,000 military personnel in Vietnam who were training South Vietnamese officials. By the time, unfortunately, of JFK's assassination, his last day in office, we had about 16,000, and they weren't just training, they were also fighting a little bit. And so Truman kind of dips her toes in the Vietnamese waters. Eisenhower kind of puts her foot into the ankle. JFK kind of like wades into the waters up to the knees. LBJ, the next president's going to splash full bore, completely dive into South Vietnam and protecting their independence from North Vietnam. DM gets assassinated. Look, just a couple weeks before JFK, unfortunately, is assassinated. And it kind of shocks and disturbs JFK. DM was kind of like our guy. He supported us politically. We supported him politically. He had a heavy hand, though, and he oppressed a lot of South Vietnamese. But, hey, he was against the communists, so we decided to support him anyways. But we started to think, you know, he's too heavy-handed. He's not enough pro-freedom. And so we gave approval to remove him. But JFK just thought, hey, he'll be removed and he'll be fine. And when he gets removed, he gets assassinated. JFK's just stunned, and he's like, you know, this is a nightmare. This may be true. This might not be true, but some people speculate that JFK's thinking about maybe getting out of Vietnam at this point because he's like, maybe this is just too big of a nightmare. Plus, Eisenhower, who often talked to JFK, was advising him that, look, we don't want our boys to be fighting in a jungle. And, but who knows? We don't honestly know what JFK would or wouldn't have done, unfortunately, because he gets assassinated in Dallas a couple weeks after this event. But Robert McNamara, he's the Secretary of Defense. I just told you about that Fog of War documentary by Earl Morris. Great. If you're bored on a weekend, watch it. You learn about World War II. You learn about the Vietnam War. You learn about the Cuban Missile Crisis. You learn about Ford Motor Company. He was the first president who wasn't a Ford family member to run the company, and he helped do things like padded steering wheels and the seatbelt at Ford. He helped introduce those. Anyways, Secretary of Defense under JFK and much of LBJ's presidency, and he helps kind of formulate a lot of these Vietnam policies and so forth. Camelot. People always talk about, oh, the Kennedys, good-looking young family, cute little kids. Oh, Jackie Kennedy. Oh, what a nice, pretty lady, or whatever they would say. And, oh, she's so fashionable. She redecorated the White House, and she got the TV cameras, the news cameras in. And they, you know, and she pointed out, oh, look, I redecorated this. I retouched this up. This had been in storage in a museum, and it was George Washington's, and I brought it out, and now it's a part of the White House again. And, or, you know, just whatever. I guess anything George Washington's that he personally used. He didn't actually live in the White House. But anyways, but there were some George Washington things that were in there and then got taken out. But it's just kind of fascinating. But the media kind of just like fell in love with the Kennedys. But Southern Democrats start to break off and give some swing votes to the Republicans or Northern Democrats. They can go either way. There's even times where they form their own party called the Dixiecrats or the States' Rights Party. But the Southern Democrats, why are they starting to get upset with JFK? Why are they starting to get upset with some of the Northern Democrats? The Northern Democrats tended to be more urban. Northern Republicans tended to be more rural. But why are they upset with the Northern Democrats? Because the Northern Democrats are advocating African-American civil rights. That's perturbing the white Southern Democrats. And you're going to start to see a massive shift. African-Americans, like I said, had been loyal Republican voters up until about FDR, and they start becoming like swing voters. And now they're going to become heavily Democrat voters in this area here in the mid-60s. JFK advocates tax cuts. He says a rising tide lifts all boats. JFK he said, look, I don't have a mandate. I can't tax aggressively. I can't seek more liberal social spending. And if I can't tax aggressively and we don't have more liberal social spending, you know, we got to then we might as well wind up cutting some taxes. You know, remember JFK won a narrow election against Nixon. And a lot of people thought there was some fraud. I don't know how accurate that is, but people talked about fraud in Texas, fraud in Illinois, the two states JFK barely won. Who knows? But the fact of the matter is, sometimes it doesn't matter what is real or not. What is perception, even if it's a false perception, sometimes drives political reality. And Republicans wanted to lower spending anyways, just overall generally speaking, if he lowered taxes, which he opposed though. But he did lower, and he did wind up lowering taxes for all. And that ended up making a lot of Republicans happy. And Republicans tend to argue for lower taxes, generally speaking. Of course, there's exceptions, but this is a general rule of thumb on a lot of issues in the 1900s here. Even, like, for example, Coolidge is a big lower tax guy. We talked about him from the 1920s. But the Freedom Riders, CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, they have these freedom rides, and look how ridiculous this is. So when you get people arrested, why are they arrested? Because they rode on a bus with different races. You can see, like, here's like a looks like a minister and different people. So they got arrested because they rode on a bus that was desegregated. People literally attacked the buses. Why? Because they're different races all riding on this. Who cares? You would think. But apparently that upset enough people that they would meet the buses with violence. Now, basically, the courts basically said that buses that cross state lines had to be integrated. They couldn't be segregated. So people like this, these freedom riders, who were part of CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality, then would ride on the bus together, desegregated. As you can see, there's different races in there, and then to kind of test the law. And JFK, once the violence started happening, JFK actually had to send the military in to basically protect these people. There's the military right there, actually. You can see. But, I mean, how embarrassing is that? You have to send the military to protect people. Why do they need protection? Because they're riding on a bus with different races, and apparently that's provoking violence enough where you have to get the military involved. It kind of shows you how different the era is in a lot of ways, to that it would be violent simply for that reason. You can see some people on the bus here. You can see there's some different races in here with different people. Oh, that's I'm okay there and stuff too. But you can see just kind of like what's going on there, and that's just it's just kind of insane to think that people would get violent over something that seems so small today. Like who cares today? But Robert Kennedy is his brother, and he ends up becoming the Attorney General, kind of like the top lawyer of the country. And he says he helps with the civil rights. And he actually later runs for president himself in the 1968 presidential election. Unfortunately, he himself gets assassinated also in Los Angeles during that 1968 election. And big part of his 1968 campaign was was civil rights and things like that. But as the Attorney General, it's really interesting because you hear him arguing with these Southern governors and Southern politicians. What's really interesting is he argues on legal grounds, not moral grounds. And I'm not faulting him for this. In some ways, it's actually kind of smart, because you argue on moral grounds. So different people have different morals, and we can argue about my morals are different, and that's okay, and my morals are better than your morals. We can argue about that all day, but he just focuses on legal. And here are these Southern governors, and they're just whining about how segregation's good and it's moral, and that's what their voters want or whatever. And he just calmly is talking about legal reasons. Well, look, the law is this, and the law says we have to desegregate, and my job as a top lawyer is to make sure laws are getting enforced, and as the Attorney General, I have to help enforce laws, and you know, if the laws are this, I'll do that. If the laws are that, I'll do that. But the fact of the matter is, this is what the law says, and I don't have any wiggle room. And I think that's pretty good, because like he kept telling the governors, look, I have no wiggle room. The law is the law. My job is to enforce the law. You know, you don't want me to enforce the law, see if you can change the law. But until then, I'm enforcing the law. And I think that was kind of good, because it kind of shut down a lot of the debates he was having with the governors when they realized he was just, look, I'm going to enforce the law. Look, this court says we have to desegregate that. I'm going to desegregate that. My job's not to listen to you whine. My job's to enforce what the courts say. My job's to enforce what the law says. May 3rd, 1963, march on Birmingham. This guy, Bull Connor, he's like in charge of the police and fire department there. Just horrific. Fire hoses, dogs, sicked on peaceful protesters. Remember, and I want to make sure this is clear, these protesters were not rioting, they were not looting, they were not committing arson, they were not damaging houses, they were not destroying anyone's property, they were not keying cars or flipping cars over. These marchers were 100% peaceful, and Bull Connor, the local guy here, who's in charge of the police and fire department, turns fire hoses. These fire hoses are designed to shoot up like several stories high, high-powered. It was said they could strip a bark off a tree, and you literally see grown adults getting knocked down by these fire hoses and swept down the pavement. That must have hurt too, having your skin rub against the pavement, and sicking dogs on people for peacefully protesting. Dear Lord. And so Bull Connor gets a lot of negative attention, and it actually starts to persuade a lot of Northerners. There's a lot of white Northerners who maybe were apathetic. I don't know if maybe that's the best way to say it, but there's a lot of white Northerners who are maybe kind of indifferent about, maybe, yeah, they're like, yeah, maybe they deserve civil rights, but, it's way down there. It's none of my business. A lot of white Northerners started to support civil rights when they saw Bull Connor just beating the crap out of people for peacefully protesting. And it's dramatically swayed public opinion on behalf of people like Martin Luther King Jr., who's organizing protests. And so other people are too, but MLK is like the biggest name organizing protests at this time. And then real quick, I'll kind of get through these here. And Supreme Court, Warren Supreme Court, Earl Warren. John Marshall is probably the most famous Supreme Court justice. I put him in that Great American Tournament because he changes the government forever. John Marshall, the guy nominated in early U.S. history by John Adams, the second president, puts John Marshall. John Marshall expands the national government's power at the expense of states' rights. John Marshall creates the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court basically barely existed. The Supreme Court didn't even have their own building. They met in a tavern before John Marshall. John Marshall gives them a power, things like judicial review and Marbury v. Madison. John Marshall expands the national government's power at the expense of the state governments just dramatically. Earl Warren is just as big. Earl Warren, he had been a former governor of California, had been the attorney general of California. He had unfortunately argued on behalf of the whole Japanese internment camps. But the fact of the matter is, some people think Earl Warren regretted that and wanted to make amends on that. But Earl Warren, he's famous for he expands civil rights more than any other Supreme Court Chief Justice in U.S. history, more than any Supreme Court member in U.S. history. He expands the rights of people dramatically. He's the Supreme Court Chief Justice in Brown v. Board of Education, which starts the desegregation process. Albeit slowly, it does start the desegregation process. Gideon v. Wainwright. You have to provide lawyers for criminal cases. If a poor person can't afford their lawyer, or a rich person doesn't want to buy their own lawyer, you have to provide a lawyer. If the government is charged, and I want to make sure this is clear. So like, if the government's accusing you of a crime, the government has to provide you with a reasonable defense lawyer if you want one. And that's thanks to Earl Warren. Earl Warren expands rights more than any other person on the Supreme Court in U.S. history, and it's not really up for any serious debate. He's at the forefront of all these, and he's so good at convincing other people in the court. Like he told people, this Brown v. Board has to be unanimous. It has to be unanimous. I just want to make sure we're clear on this. So like if I'm suing another person and it's not the government accusing me of a crime, they don't have to provide me a lawyer. But if the government's accusing me of a crime, they have to provide me a lawyer. Escobedo v. Illinois, 1964, you have a right to a lawyer during interrogation. So this is during the court trial. This is during your interrogation. A lawyer you have to be informed. You have a right to have a lawyer present who can inform you of your rights. Maybe when you should stop speaking or whatever. I don't know. Miranda v. Arizona, 1966. This Miranda guy was an absolute crud. He brutally raped this poor girl and kidnapped her and all this. But he ended up getting let off. Not completely. He still had, I don't remember exactly, but he still got like a not as big of a jail sentence, but he still got something. But basically, all evidence collected during interrogations is only permissible in court if the cops can show that they informed you of your rights. That's why, like, when you watch movies, you know, and they're arresting somebody, the cops always read them quote, their Miranda rights. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you do or say can be used against you in a court of law. You know, if you don't have a lawyer, we can appoint you one. You know, blah, 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 blah. And so any evidence collected during the interrogation, it can be thrown out if the cops didn't inform you of your various rights, including that you have a right to a lawyer. And then Baker v. Carr, fair representation in Tennessee. Tennessee, now the African Americans in Tennessee, you might be thinking of the old sharecropper days where they're living in rural areas, but the African Americans have moved to the urban areas, even in the South, for factory jobs as agriculture becomes more mechanized through the years. And so African Americans tend to live in the bigger cities, like, for example, Memphis, Tennessee, a bigger city. And basically Tennessee is basically giving out representation in their state legislature based, like some small little city might have as much representation as Memphis, the biggest city in Tennessee. Why? Oh, just because that's, you know, one city, one vote, or, you know, one representative, or something stupid. And he says, no, 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 you're essentially disenfranchising black voters by doing that on purpose. And you can't do that. And some of you might be thinking, well, doesn't the national government maybe not do that on racial grounds per se, but you look at like Wyoming, which barely has 500,000 people, has something like 600,000 people, and then California has, like, you know, over, you know, close to 40 million people, and yet they both get 2 senators. But the U.S. Constitution is still the U.S. Constitution, but states can't behave like that. And then last but not least, Engel v. Vital, 1962, bans school-sponsored prayer. Now, kids can still pray in school if they choose, but a school can't say, okay, kids, we're coming on the intercom right now and we're all going to pray, bow your heads. At a public school, now if you were to go to like a religious school of whatever faith, you could do that. It's a private school at that point. But at public schools, you can't have school-sponsored prayer. Now, kids can still choose to pray. You know, like kids could choose to, you know, hey, we're going to meet during lunch and pray over here in the corner. And that's fine. But school officials can't sponsor a prayer. All right, let me know if you have any questions. Sorry the video is so long, but there's so much going on in this chapter. Have a good day, kids. Stay out of trouble.